So this week we are reading the Parsha of Noach. At the end of Simchat Torah, we concluded the reading of the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, began right away with Breshit, which kind of gets short shrifted because it's really subsumed in the holiday. So in many ways, Noach is really where the Torah starts in the Jewish New Year. And this story is very well known, not only in religious circles, both for Jews and Christians, and just people who know nothing about religion often know the story of Noah and Noah's Ark through songs, through cartoons, etc. And in fact, if you look at ancient cultures, just the very idea of one particular man surviving a great flood exists in ancient cultures. Now, whether or not that buttresses and supports the idea that this really happened is not our main point there, but clearly there's something powerful about this story, that it is cross-cultural and it is timeless. And even though there's other stuff in the Parasha in this week's reading, it's clear that the story of Noah and the downfall of mankind, and God saying that this is bad. I've essentially, I don't know if God says I failed, but mankind has failed. We have to hit the reset button, start again, flood, wipe it out, a rainbow promise that God will never do it again. But that's not the only story of God looking down at mankind and saying, boy, this is not going the way that I had planned. There's another story tucked in the end, and again, it's not the what doesn't take top billing in this week's Parsha, and that's the story of Bavel, or Bavel. The Babel Tower is where many different people come together, speaking one nation of one mind, and they say, let's build a giant tower, a giant structure, so that we are not forgotten from the earth. And God says, nope. And then God spreads them out, doing different languages. And the questions, there's a number of questions, but one is, what was so bad that was going on here? And B, are these stories connected in any way? So what we're going to do is, first, we're going to look at each story and try and figure out what was the real sin there. What was so evil that God recognized that mankind could no longer continue in this way? And then see if these two stories teach us anything about what humanity can and should be. And what we'll see, as I've hinted at in the title of this class, Two Extremes of Civilization, is both of these stories look at two extremes of society. And we'll see what that is in just a moment. But they teach us a lot about how we should approach creating civilization, how people should live in the world. So Jane and Ellis, since you're just at the top of my list of people, I'll go ahead and unmute you. And then Ellis, if you would take this first source, it's from Breshit, and it's just a short section from when God describes why God wants to wipe out the world in the story of the flood, which in Hebrew is the Mabul, which doesn't translate directly as water flood. It's the great mixing up or undoing of creation. So Ellis, please, source one.
And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with thievery. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with thievery through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth.
Excellent. So a very quick summation essentially of God, what God is going to do and why. One thing to point out, the word there they use thievery, the Hebrew for it is Hamas. And there are more than one translation of Hamas, and the rabbis have a field day with figuring out what Hamas is, whether it's not connected to the modern Hamas, which I guess thematically it is, because the modern Hamas is an evil, corrupt terrorist organization that brings only evil on the earth. And so to this Hamas is implying a absolute corruption of human behavior, except if it's just thievery, really God would wipe out the world because of thievery. So the rabbis recognize it's not necessarily the specific sins, because, as I'll actually talk about on Shabbat, if we just look at the sins they did, there's nothing that they did in the times of Noah that we don't do today. Now, it's not as widespread necessarily, but all of the horrible sins that are forbidden in the Torah, unfortunately, still happens quite a bit today. So it can't be the individual sins, because God obviously accepts repentance now. So why did God need to wipe out the world then? So if we look at source number 2, this is a Paris-born American rabbi who moved to Israel in the 70s. He passed away very recently, just a few years ago, and he was one of the greatest minds ever, just ever, but particularly for modern Orthodox Judaism Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, and he writes this short piece here about what the real sin, what the real falling apart of society was. So Jane, if you would take source 2 here from Rav Lichtenstein, that's all.
In the generation of the flood, it says, and the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with thievery. They stole from each other, and they grabbed each other's women. They think only on the present. All of their thoughts were given over to filling their desires and inclinations. They didn't have even minimal unity. They didn't have a vision of a future. Every person thought only about themselves and on their enjoyment in the moment. It reached a pinnacle in Pasuk 12 when it said, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. As Rashi says, even cattle, beasts, and fowl would mate with those who were not of their own species. In this generation, there was deviation from the normal way of things and social and economical corruption that goes beyond all boundaries.
Excellent, thank you. So what we see here is total and complete freedom run amok, even amongst animals. All living creatures did whatever they wanted. We hear about this famous philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the social contract. And to oversimplify it, the idea is if you want to live in a functional civilization, even though freedom is an important facet or an important value, you give up certain freedom so you can live with your neighbor. I want to be able to wear what I want, do what I want. Well, if I want to live in society, I have to wear clothes, or I have to recognize the borders of my neighbor's property. A lot of those principles and values are the building blocks of the Torah. Yes, you have freedom, but if you want to live with other people, you have to respect their rights as well. This is a complete and total breakdown of any kind of cohesion or cohesiveness of society. Everyone did whatever they wanted. No one cared about anyone else. It was every creature for themselves. So it wasn't about stealing. People steal. Even people who are not monsters sometimes may steal or shoplift. It's not good, but they're not going to destroy society. But here, it's not about the fact that they were stealing. It's they were stealing because they thought, I don't really care if it belongs to you. I take what I want whenever I want. That's when God recognized it's not a matter of individual sins. It's a matter of all of society. There is no society. There's nothing to break down anymore. There's no idea of civilization. That is one absurd extreme. And we've seen moments like that throughout history. Because if it's a matter of sins, God can say there's punishments for the sins. And here's a court and judges and police officers that can enforce that. Well, there's nothing like that. There's no system of enforcement, no sense of punishment, no sense of consequences, nothing. It's a total and complete mess. That's why God had to hit the reset button. But now we're going to see that civilization is going to swing the other way. So before we look at the story of Bavel, even though we went through this rather quickly, are there any questions up until now? I'll pause for you to think. And again, if you have questions later, bring it out. So yeah, Jane, please.
So do Israelis spell Hamas the same way?
You know what? I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if there's an etymological connection there. I don't know. If somebody wants to Google it and then raise their hand and say, I found the etymological root of it, then we can share it here when we post the class. But I don't know the connection of it off the top of my head. I just know that the rabbis typically do thievery, but it could also be violence or some other specific sin. But again, it's not about what Hamas is. It's about a complete breakdown of society, as Rav Lichtenstein writes so beautifully. But again, now we're about to see the pendulum swing in the other extreme. So Larry, I'm going to unmute you. Just gotta, and I hope, is it okay that I call you Larry? I see it's Lawrence here, but
absolutely.
I heard someone else call you Larry, so I figured, and welcome, it's wonderful to have you. So source number 3 here, it's a bit longer, but it's going to describe, and it's really the end of the reading for this week. It's the whole story of Bavel, basically, and just a relatively few number of verses. So if you would take source number 3, please.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah, please.
Great. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Bricks serve them as stone, and bitumen serve them as mortar. And they said, come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world. The Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built. And the Lord said, if, as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Thus, the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confounded the speech of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Thank you. And just an interesting etymological thing here, the word Bavel, all mixed up, is connected to the word Mabul for the flood. So when all of society broke down and everybody was already separate, they wanted nothing to do with each other, God mixed it all up to restart with a Mabul. But then there was an overcorrection, which is where everybody started to unite as one, potentially against God. Well, that's not really what they're saying. They're saying, let's continue, let's be united so that we're never wiped off the face of the earth. And then God says, well, that's also too much of an extreme, as we'll unpack in a moment. So God mixed them up again with a Bavel. So it's not even about God destroying life. It's about God restructuring life. That's sort of an understatement there, but there's something interesting going on here, that there's two resets and they both use the same idea of let's confuse things and start again. And now, as you look at the global world today, everything is still pretty mixed up and mobbled, as it were. And is that the kind of world that God really did want? And that's an interesting question. But what we're going to do now is we're going to look at two more commentaries. This next one is a 19th century Polish rabbi. His acronym is the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and his work is Ha'emek Devar, to look deeply into the thing. And what he's going to do is kind of a verse by verse, looking at what was the sin. What was so bad about a bunch of people working together so beautifully to build a building? Some of our greatest structures in mankind, from the pyramids to the Eiffel Tower to the Empire State Building, were because a bunch of people worked together. And no one's going to say that it's sinful, that the Eiffel Tower is an affront to God. Maybe someone said that, but I don't think that's the general understanding of it. So what's going on here that God would see and say, this is not okay? So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And Larry, thank you for reading. So Gloria, just got to click on your side. Gloria, if you would read this first source here from Ha'emek Devar. And the first thing he comments on is one of the first things he said is all the people spoke one language. What's wrong with one language? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody could communicate with each other? Gloria, please.
One language. That is what causes the first sin, that they agreed to stop in one single place. And this is against the will of God, who said to fill the land and replenish it. That is, to walk in all its places, since the land was created to be settled.
So this is something that people usually don't think about with the story of Bavel. They think, okay, everybody got together in one place and they were trying to fight against God. That's not why God was mad. God created mankind and said, I want you to spread out over all the earth. But they said, we're happy settling down right here. We're all getting along so nicely. And God said, that's great, but that's not what I want. I want you to go from Antarctica to Japan to Milwaukee. I want all of these places to have human beings. There's a mission I have for you on earth, and you cannot accomplish it if you settle down just here in the middle of the fertile crescent. I need you to spread out on the earth. So what's interesting is, in this understanding, in this comment of the Netziv, what they did isn't evil. And it's not even selfish. It's not fundamentally bad. It just goes against God's plan. So it's not even a subversion or perversion of God's plan. What they're doing seems like such a nice idea, but God is saying, that's great, guys. I respect and validate what you're doing, but I didn't create you to settle in one city and stop. I need this earth to be filled with you. And then there's a separate conversation about whether that's been good for the earth. But he continues here in source number 5. Gloria, if you want to take source 5, and then Leonard, you can take source number 6. Gloria, source 5, please.
And the same words, the text did not explain what those words were. Rather, it leaves as a hint, as explained in Midrashim. But the words themselves are not explained by the text. It just tells us that they were the same words to teach us that it wasn't because of the content of the words themselves that the Holy One of blessing was distressed. They were what they were, and in its simplicity, there is not sin, and on the contrary, all appears well. But here, what happened is that all thought the same thing, and this came to be the problem of the settlement.
Excellent. So we're going to unpack that more in the final source of the class. But here he's saying, this is where I got that idea from. There's nothing really wrong. They're all getting along so beautifully. They finally agree. They're not murdering each other in the streets. They're not robbing each other's homes and doing even worse things. That's what happened in Noach. Shouldn't God be pleased that mankind is finally getting along together so beautifully, that they finally accept that we're all in this together? This seems crazy. This seems exactly what God wanted. So Leonard, source number 6, please.
Lest we be scattered, however, we must understand why they feared that someone might leave to another land. And it is understood that this was related to the uniformity that was among them. And since the opinions of people are not identical, they feared that people might abandon this philosophy and adopt another. Therefore, they sought to ensure that no one would leave their society. And one who veered from this uniformity among them was judged with burning, just as they did to our forefather Abraham. And the same words can also be seen as the fact that they would kill whoever did not think like them.
Thank you, Leonard. Now it gets interesting. Here's the twist. If you had just read this previous comment of the Netziv, you would say, well, it looks like a utopia. Everyone's getting along beautifully. They're all happy with each other. But then you read this number 6, and it keeps talking about the they. Who is the they? And you start realizing, as it says, people's opinions are different. But that's not okay. Somebody may say, I do want to move to Milwaukee. I want to move to Shorewood and settle my family there. I don't want to live here in the Nile Valley. And they say, you may not leave. You must stay here. You must say the same words as us. You must think the same things as us. So now we're starting to get into what the real issue is. Now, in the story of Noach, everyone really did think for themselves, but there was no authority whatsoever. There was no unified vision. There was no respect for others' beliefs. There was no respect that other people could think differently, and that was okay. There was no space for that. Here, the overcorrection is not that everyone says, you know what, that didn't work. Let's kumbaya, and we all want the same thing, and we just get along. No, what you had is clearly some form of leadership that said the overcorrection is everyone better get along, or we'll kill them, and we'll destroy them. They must believe one thing, speak one thing, eat one thing. And we have all seen what happens when leadership, different leaders throughout history have tried to do that. Everyone must think one thing, and if they don't, we will make them disappear to Siberia or a concentration camp. And unfortunately, this pattern has continued throughout the ages for thousands of years, not just recent history. So now we're starting to see why this other extreme of everybody getting along doesn't really exist. Maybe in the times to come of Mashiach, where everyone actually knows that God is real, people will actually get along because they'll know the secrets of the universe. But the reality is people don't just get along unless they have a common goal or they're being forced to. And before we go on to the final source, any thoughts up until now or questions?
I just had one thought. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Oh, yes. Please,
okay.
Katie.
So last year I took this year-long Bible class, and I can't remember who it was, but it was I think a prophet. And when the Jews were returning from, I think it was Judah to go down to Israel, but they had already acclimated to where Nebuchadnezzar was, I think it was. Yeah. I'm really bad on history. But when they came back, the prophet or whoever, the leader said, well, you've got to divorce anybody who had intermarried.
Yeah,
you know
you're
what I'm
talking about
talking
Ezra
about?
and Nehemiah.
Yes, exactly. And it's really the same kind of concept, right? Because he said you have to all be the same. You can't
Mm.
accept anyone who's intermarried. You can't accept anyone who's deviated, and that didn't work for them.
So it's interesting that you say that, and there's a lot of truth to what you're saying in a few different ways. One of them is that when Ezra and Nehemiah, when they were speaking to the people, they said they were ripping their hair out, beating the people, and saying you can't be intermarried, you have to learn Hebrew, and the people were like, go away, go to heck, I don't want to deal with you. And they realized that the way that you convince people to do something, to embrace Judaism, is not with anger, not by hitting them. It's by inspiring them, by teaching them. And these teachers, these leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah, essentially changed their tack and said, you know what, from here on out, let's commit to a common goal in the future. For those of you who are, you're intermarried, you speak another language, that's the world you grew up in. That's what you know, and we respect that. But we do want to create something different here. We want to bring back the temple. We want to educate the next generation of the value of a rich Jewish life here. So I think there's a balance there. In a society, you don't want to beat people down and say, you have to follow our laws or we'll kill you. At the same time, though, if you're trying to create something bigger and more important and more meaningful, there are certain things that you accept. And the question is, how do you get people to do that? So if we want to have a functioning society, we need people to not go around robbing stores and shooting people. So we decided that that's one extreme. So we will have police. And if someone tries to murder someone, then we will either kill them or throw them in jail or do something extreme. But we also want a society of people who are highly educated. But no one's going to put a gun to someone's head and say, you have to go to college. But with high school, or at least elementary school, that is a value. So there are certain penalties, not extreme like jail, but there might be fines. So it's this fine balance between, if we want to create a functioning society, sometimes we need to put our foot down. But at the same time, we can't be too extreme or we'll push people away. So it's that extreme here between the story of the flood, where everyone do whatever you want, and the story of Babel, where everyone has to do the same thing or they'll be burned alive. And both of those extremes do not work. There has to be something in the middle. And the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is exactly, or not just about that, but it really is trying to find that balance between a people who are lost and we want to bring back Judaism, but we also don't want to force it upon them. Such a tension, a metach, they say in Hebrew. And this final source here from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who really just passed away recently, he was the chief rabbi of Britain, but his legacy will be in his writings, really understands what's going on and how this tension plays out, and how it speaks to us about understanding, about not oppressing others with our own belief system. So I'll read this final source here. And you can actually see from the name of the essay, Interfaith Respect is Vital. He wrote this essay on Parshat Noach during, I think, something called Interfaith Week. So here he makes it about, there's certain things that we believe in our kishkas, we know are true, but to force it on others gains nothing. So he's here going to start by unpacking the story of Bavel. And even though that story was written kind of like a fable, it was talking about something that really was happening in the ancient world. And again, we've seen it in our modern world. He says, thanks to archaeology, we can now answer both questions. He had the questions that we've been talking about the connection between Noach and Bavel. Mesopotamia, which included Bavel, Babylon, was the home of the world's first empires. The Neo-Assyrians developed the practice of imposing their own language, Akkadian, on the peoples and nations they conquered. So the Torah, God's Torah, didn't spell out every little detail, but they were giving the test case for what was really happening in the ancient world. They didn't want to say the Assyrians did it, the Babylonians did it. They were saying, this is happening. And the truth is, it's a timeless story because we've seen it happen throughout history of nations imposing their own language, belief system, patriotism run amok. Ashurbanipal II boasted that he made all peoples speak one speech. That is an archaeological fact that we have proof for. That's exactly what the Tower of Babel, that story, is talking about. Sargon II claimed that he had conquered many nations with strange tongues and incompatible speech. No, he doesn't value the fact that they have different, unique histories and languages, and caused them all to accept a single voice. It's the story of Babel. The one language and common speech of Babel was not a primordial unity, meaning it wasn't a utopia that everyone naturally just spoke the same language. It was beautiful, but the result of ruthless imperialism, whose symbol was the 300-foot-high Etemenanki ziggurat. A ziggurat is kind of like a ramped pyramid, as opposed to smooth sides. It goes up by steps. The story of Jacob's ladder probably wasn't a ladder like you see on the side of your house. It probably was this ramped pyramid, which makes more sense when you think of the angels walking up one side and then walking down the other. And ramped ziggurats were basically the main kind of temple in the days of Jacob in the Torah. That was an aside. Ziggurat beside the Marduk temple, whose name, Esagila, means tower with its head in the heavens, almost exactly as the Bible describes it. It's really cool when you see things in the Torah and you're like, oh, wow, it's describing something that we can prove outside the Torah. The story of Bavel is critique of imperialism, the imposition of a single culture on a plural world. It is followed by the story of Abraham, the man commanded to be different to show that God loves difference. But Abraham's job was not to make everyone different like him. It was for one nation to be unique. We can now summarize the human story as told in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. There are two perennial dangers. The first is lawlessness and violence we still see in failed and failing states that lack the rule of law. That's the story of the flood. That's exactly what he's talking about, a complete lack of any civilization, any imposition of law. But the second is imperialism, the attempt to impose a single culture on a plural world, i.e. a totalitarian state. Two extremes, both always fail. Read this way, the Bible teaches that God creates cultural diversity just as he created biodiversity. If we go to the 10 Commandments, it does not say there are no other gods in the world. It says to you, my Israelites, my children, you cannot have other gods. You are unique to me. But you know what? The other cultures with their other gods, as long as they're not murderers and they're not sacrificing children, Gesundheit hate, they should be their religion. Christians can be Christians, Muslims be Muslims, those who worship the Greek religion, as long as they're not murdering others and they respect others, God recognizes that that's their way in the world. That's their way to discover the truth of God. Jews be Jews, everyone else be everyone else. There's only one God, but, and this is Rabbi Sachs's beautiful and unique philosophy, there may be more than one path to his presence. And that is a validation in many ways of almost, not all, but almost every other faith, religion, and culture, perhaps even atheism, someone just trying to find their truth in the world. That is what makes respect between faiths both possible and necessary. It is a lesson we must never forget. So if somebody says there should be no religion whatsoever, everyone should do what they want, we know how that story ends. But if there's a religion that says everyone should believe what we believe, we can look at the world right now and see how that's going. Both of those extremes have failed time and again. And what's so painful is humanity keeps trying that. You have people who say, I throw off law, I want to do what I want, and we see what happens. And we have countries that are in the world today, North Korea, other countries that try and impose their will, and they are suffering. People are starving, people are being killed. We don't know how many are being killed. Both of those models are failed, but a model where each civilization has a balance between a shared set of values that we agree we are going to follow, and we're going to have certain laws and consequences within our group for those who choose not to follow them, but at the same time, we will respect those who are different from us, who choose not to follow that. And that's true within Judaism and between Judaism and other religions, and it's a constant struggle. And it's very easy to fall into the extreme of either camp, again, within one religion or between other religions. It is a constant struggle. But if you could get to that balance between all religions respecting each other and all trying to work towards a greater good, that would be a utopia. That would be the Garden of Eden. And in many ways, we've all just been trying to get back there since we got kicked out the first time.